All right, let's start. Welcome to the first Inclus webinar this year, From Risk Appetite and Tolerance to Decision Making. I will be joined today by Mark Boult from Boult Consulting in the UK, and Mikaeli Langinvainio, who's the CEO and co-founder of Inclus here in Helsinki, Finland. Welcome, gentlemen. Good to have you.
Thank you.
We have an exciting topic today, clearly, since you are so many, but we probably had a record number of sign-ups to this webinar. So clearly, there's a lot of interest towards this topic. So that's great. We'll do our best to exchange practices and observations of setting the risk appetite and risk tolerance and discussing ways to apply them at different organizational levels as well. Before we go to the discussion, just briefly about the background of and expertise of our presenters today. So Mark Boult is a highly experienced risk management consultant with over 40 years of experience on the topic. He supported clients with risk management and assurance activities from board level to frontline operations in a wide range of industries, including oil and gas and chemicals and government agencies, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, and so on and so forth. Mark has supported risk management operations in countries around the world, from the UK and Europe to Middle East and Africa, the Americas, and even in Australia. Additionally, Mark is a member of the UK Standards Committee for Risk Management and Governance, and the ISO committees for risk management and sustainability, inputting to the ISO 31000 and ISO 37000 families of international standards. So welcome, Mark. Good to have you.
Thank you.
And then we have Mikaeli Langinvainio, and Mikaeli in turn has more than 20 years of experience in business and crisis management and peace negotiations in more than 20 countries all over the world. Mikaeli's background includes working at CMI, the Martti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, as senior manager, leading the methods and tools unit. Over his career, he has designed and facilitated dozens of peace mediation, risk management, and policy development processes of national importance in some of the world's most challenging environments. Mikaeli has also worked at the Finnish Defence Administration as a strategic analysis team leader. He has also acted as the national coordinator of civilian crisis management training and research at the Finnish Ministry of Interior, taking part in establishing the Crisis Management Center and representing Finland at the European Union. In 2012, Mikaeli co-founded Inclus that provides software to support risk management processes in a collaborative fashion. My name is Irmeli Hirvensalo, and I'm heading up marketing here at Inclus. My role today is primarily to manage time and introduce topics, because we have a whole range of them, and I know we have our gentlemen are really knowledgeable, so we have a lot to cover today. So I'm trying to be mindful of the time, as we have agreed with the gentlemen. Just a couple of practicalities before we go to the topic. So basically, at any time, if you want to ask questions or provide comments, then please do so through the chat. We will be keeping an eye on the chat and addressing questions as we go along, or then towards the end of the webinar. And we'll be recording this webinar, and we'll send you the link afterwards. But okay, let's then actually go to the discussion, and I will take out my screen so it doesn't come in the way. All right, let's start with definitions. Now, we are talking about risk appetite and risk tolerance today. So what do we actually mean by the concepts, and how do you differentiate between risk appetite and risk tolerance? Maybe Mark, you would like to start, please.
That's a pleasure, and thank you for having me. I think the place I'd start is if you think about sort of corporate governance codes which countries have, which sort of set out expectations. And okay, my bias will be knowing the UK better than other countries, but I have looked at other countries' codes and they're all similar. And fundamentally, they say that the board should determine the nature and extent of the principal risks that the organisation is willing to take to achieve its objectives or its strategic objectives. So you can say that in stating what your the nature and extent of principal risks, you are stating a sort of a risk appetite. And if you look at sort of various things like the ISO standards, they'll talk about risk appetite being the amount and type of risk that you are willing to take. So it is something which at a strategic level or in a strategic environment, it's looking at how much risk will I take to be able to achieve my objectives and achieve the benefits. So you're balancing the two. Tolerance, if you look at things like ISO again, it is the amount of risk that you feel you could bear, if you have to bear it, beyond which you could say that the risk is intolerable or unacceptable. So I am willing to accept up to a certain level of risk in the way I do things. Now, there are other terms that people have around it. There'll be things like risk capacity. That's seen as the amount of risk I could take without myself going bust, in simple terms. People will talk about risk exposure, which is about the amount of risk you're probably taking today. So there's a balance so there's all these different words which are used within the environment. So simply put, tolerance is a sort of limit to what you're willing to take. Appetite is the amount you are willing to take for the achievement of the objectives and the benefits. And in general, tolerance, you could say, would be a higher level of risk than your appetite in most cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the definitions. Do you have anything to add, Miki?
Yeah, great opening, Mark. So I would maybe start from a more, let's say, broad philosophical sort of standpoint of setting the objectives. People in life typically do some objectives, and corporations are, notorious well suited often to create long-standing strategy processes with ambitious goals and visualizations how to get there and so on. But often it's sort of perhaps a little bit overlooked that the more ambitious you want to be, the more you are stacking obstacles, uncertainties, and resistance to yourself. So when you're creating an appetite for more growth, more money, better achievements, and milestones, typically they come with risk. And you are basically then often increasing your risk appetite the more ambitious you want to be in the business side. But that's not always, of course, the case. But are you taking the risk consciously or unconsciously is the thing. So are you taking the risk with an appetite to actually take the risk is the question here. And I would say that that sort of the risk appetite is a process where you want to take the risk to maximize your opportunities that you can see consciously. And of course, if you take too much risk, you will likely suffer the consequences, and it's a balance. But sort of, I would say that the era of uncertainty that we are now facing, the most important, or one of the most important things is what are the risks that we are having the risk appetite for. So selecting the risks that you are actually sort of accepting or where you're having the best appetite. And I would say that it's not about taking, of course, it's not about taking stupid risk. It's about taking smart, informed risks. But you first have to understand what are the risks. And first of all, you have to understand what is the inherent risk, what is the risk without doing anything on it, You have to understand what is the residual risk, so that the risk remaining after you've done all that you can do with reasonable resources to mitigate the risk. And that is actually then the point where you should consider the risk appetite, not before, because you should first do the risk identification and risk assessment, control actions, and think through the process, and then you can say, are we willing to still accept this risk? Of course, some risks are imposed to us, but that's the process that you actually have to consider the residual risk and what's happening after that, even if the risk realizes, and are you then able to absorb the shock or the consequences of that risk realizing. So I would start with that.
Good. Let's move on to our next topic then, setting the risk appetite and tolerance. Like, who should be responsible for that? And how do you go about it? If Mark, you could go as first.
Happy to go ahead. Okay, fundamentally, it's the people leading the organisation, the board, or if you're in different organisations, you may have a slightly different governance structure, but the sort of top level should be responsible for setting it. Obviously, they'll do it with the assistance with a lot of the people I assume who are here, who are risk managers, who will be guiding and helping them to do that. In terms of things to think, you need to think about things when you're setting your risk appetite and you're thinking about what they should be. First of all, you need to think, as is in the risk process, if people follow the standard risk process, you need to think about your context. And the context there is the external context, the environment you're within. The internal context, that's your situation. And you can also bring into that the risk context. Where in sort of risk maturity are you? What's your risk culture? And that will also influence, all of those are things that will influence how you might want to handle and deal with risk appetite and risk tolerance. And then you need to think about how you design it. And remember that something like risk appetite, it's not just about the level of risk, it's also about control. It's got two components to it, you could say, and tolerance is sort of a level of risk you can tolerate. So if I think that people from the oil and gas industry here will be very familiar with sort of ALARP concepts. You could say that the ALARP concept is more like appetite. It's I'm willing to tolerate or accept this risk if I have reduced it to as low as reasonably practical. So it's talking about a level of risk and it's talking about a level of control. So that is more like an appetite, whereas tolerance, if you think about risk matrix, maybe where you say, if I'm in the red region, some people say we won't operate there. We cannot tolerate it. It's only if we're below that line. So the line, in a sense, is more like tolerance. They both need to be measurable in order for you to be able to say, yes, I am achieving them, whether that's a qualitative or quantitative way of doing it. People will do it in both ways. So those are some things I think to think about, and in terms of what you're doing. You can go into things like, so there are some guides which will have terms in them which describe different levels of risk appetite, from sort of being risk averse to risk taking and what that means. Those guides give the meanings of the different levels and they are useful to start with, but I still think you need to interpret it to be applicable for your organization. Risk appetite also is not simply defining it as my appetite for the whole organization and everything we do is X. It is common that you break it down. So it's common to set your appetites thinking about different types of risks. It can be, or it could be about different departments or whatever, and so what is the level of risk I'm willing to accept between the different departments. But doing it in a manner that aligns to the risk taxonomy or risk categories you use in terms of managing and reporting risks. So I think that's another thing that you need to think about and bring into how you define your risk appetites and how you then go on to put those risk appetites into practice with different tools.
Yeah,
great
great points,
Thanks.
Mark. I would add that the sort of alignment of the organization on understanding what is the risk appetite on what issues is quite important, and therefore the leadership's own sort of ability, first of all, to discuss what are the risks, and secondly, determine the risk appetite on a strategic level, all the way from the board to the executive committee to the business units and then to the staff, is super important. And therefore, processes like creating a risk appetite statement, they are good, but then they do not cover the regular, or they don't replace the regular discussion around risk, where you update your understanding about the risks, where we are actually against our risk tolerance or risk appetite, and where is the risk appetite. Typically, it's very hard to set a sort of specific threshold for a risk on a risk based on a risk appetite, but it is the responsibility of the management to do so, and to be give guidelines where we should be focusing on when we are prioritizing the risk, where we are focusing on the risk mitigation actions and initiatives and our resources. So it certainly starts from the top, but then it's not only solely the responsibility of then the management or leadership to understand what is the risk appetite. But everybody in the organization always assumes what the level of risk appetite in our organization is. Well, everybody has some sort of assumption on it, and you should understand what is the assumption of people, because there can be misinterpretations, and then it affects how eagerly you go after your objectives. So it can actually start hindering your organization if there's no alignment, or then somebody is taking too much risk on issues that we don't want to take any risk, and so on. So the alignment is super important, and if you keep that in mind, that only and in itself tells you how you have to communicate and think about the risk appetite. Some thoughts on that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, can I just add a couple of thoughts for people?
Absolutely.
That goes in,
Go ahead.
which might be useful. I mean, again, we're talking about people here. If you're working to try and set risk appetite, remember things like go and talk with a range of stakeholders or interested parties. Term in ISO is changing to interested parties. So that go and talk with them, because they're going to give you an influence on what they think is the risk appetite, you could say, of an organization like yours. If you, I can remember working with an organization which was originally an energy utility, and then it started to go into oil and gas. Then you could say the natural appetite for risk in a utility tends to be lower, and in an oil and gas tends to be higher, where you're doing explorations, and there was a conflict. So if you've got to go and talk with people, and there was a conflict, therefore, between what they were doing strategically versus, you could say, what the expectation was. They were taking more risk. They had extended their risk appetite by going into oil and gas, but some of their key stakeholders, the people who held the shares, were seeing them as a utility. And so they were not so comfortable with that. So you need to go and talk and have that communication. I think that's a very important bit to remember when you're going about setting or renewing your risk appetite. That was just one thought that I had, which I think we didn't really pick out in this sort of what you should be doing. There's probably loads of others that may come through as well.
One thing that I've been actually wanting to ask you, Mark, is that how do you see that the sort of setting of risk appetite and the culture around discussing risk appetite affect the overall leadership of the organization? I've been finding out that in some cases the organizations where you clearly state that we are very risk averse and we want to avoid any kind of mishaps and mistakes on our finances and our, of course, in safety often you have to be very, very careful. But then if you sort of expand that risk awareness to all aspects of the company, it tends to create a sort of more minute and reactive culture where everybody is afraid of mistakes and nobody really wants to take any risk, and you don't share responsibilities and you don't discuss necessarily things openly and so on. That's maybe a negative side of things, but I don't know. Have you seen something similar or not?
It's quite a long question. I think that you brought up what is another important aspect, which is we need to communicate our appetite, and we need to, in a way, embed appetite tolerance into the way we work, such that we can make decisions which reflect them. And I think that is important. And there's nothing impossible about having a very low level of tolerance, you could say, and a low risk appetite for something like safety risks. It's very common everywhere. You don't take a lot of safety risk. Safety first concepts, very important, especially in what I call the more dangerous industries. But you might be willing to take a lot more risk in terms of projects. But that doesn't mean to say that you're going to do every project. So there is a sort of a limit to the amount of risk you're going to take, because there's going to be some inherent risk with the project. So you've got to sort of be able to express things in a way that says, right, this is how much risk I'm willing to take, and go from there. It may be even worth looking at sort of some of the things that you can see in terms of sort of statements that people use. And I know we've got people from many industries here, so I've sort of talked a bit about oil and gas, but if you talk about something like rail industry, and I've just picked up the national rails sort of things, you can see some of the things they talk about in appetite, in terms of their appetite. So I won't do the safety one because we've sort of covered that, but it says, for train performance, we are open to new approaches and will work across industry to find better ways to support passengers and freight users. Innovation will be supported where risks are understood and proportionate to the expected benefits. So in a sense, what they've said is, when we're looking at things there, we are going to, if we're going to innovate, we want to understand the risks around the innovation, and they need to be proportionate. And it says then, where risks are poorly understood, we will be cautious about making any decisions that could negatively impact on the train performance for passengers and freight users. So they've sort of brought in a control question there, which has said, we will not go ahead with innovations, or would be very reluctant to, if we have not got that understanding and we don't know how we would manage the risks. So that's their appetite. And I think it's quite useful to look at some of these statements and think about things in terms of how you would create your own appetites. You can draw on. You can see a lot of, for those who are risk managers here, if you want to have a look at annual reports, quite a lot of annual reports will have expressions of risk appetite in them. It's not perfect, but there is a lot of annual reports which can provide that sort of information.
Nice. That's an interesting take. I've been also sort of puzzling every now and then that can you set a risk appetite if you only do, for example, negative impact and likelihood assessment on a risk without actually assessing the opportunities involved with that particular risk? Because, like what you just said is that you have to calculate in the benefits and the upside of risk as well. But how often you see actually organizations doing that, because we're so threat oriented often in our risk management practices, and we are then looking at our core functions and we are thinking about risk as a defensive operation rather than that we are actually looking and seeking after new opportunities and we want to expand our business and so on, that we have to look beyond what we know. So do you have any sort of comments on that?
Yeah, certainly. The way I'd look at it is that we are biased in risk management. Doesn't matter how we look at it, the way it's being implemented, it's about the management of the threats to what we're trying to achieve. Yeah. And I think that if I look at how we look at opportunities, often if we identify an opportunity, effectively it becomes the goal we're going for. So it's almost is what we're going to deviate from is the opportunity upside. If you look at if you talk about an upside downside risk matrix as a reflection of, you could say, tolerance and appetite. Yeah. Downside risk matrices quite often, I'm not saying it's all the time, will have colors like red, yellow, green on the traffic light thing, where red is stop, which is an intolerant thing. So it's sort of saying we won't go beyond it. So it's got the concepts. If it's got the yellow, it might have the alert concept in it, which is a sort of an appetite statement. When we talk at opportunity, well, I've seen them in things like bronze, silver, gold, and different ranges of blue, but they don't have the same meaning because you're always, in a way, trying to think about the enablers that can get you the maximum opportunity. But there is a bit of stuff in there where you could say what you're willing, you could say your willingness to do things, or your focus might be on enablers which are going to get you into the top corner of that one, the highest returns. You'll be looking at what you can do enable at the top. If you have things where the opportunity risk is small, you might say, we're not going to worry about it. We'll deal with it in a different way. So I would say that most people's appetite tolerance stuff is all dealing with the threat side. But there is a bit where you can see in upside down risk matrices where you could argue there's a similar thinking going into the upside, but it's not normally expressed in the same way. Having said that, the network rail one was talking about innovation on one hand and the risks associated with innovating. So they are thinking a bit on upside downside in their wording. Yeah, great comment. And I often see that when we're talking about some corporations sort of structure their risk management around a concept of risk register. And what that often means for them is threat register. and you come from there and then you think about, in best cases often, or some cases you think about what are the opportunities involved with the threats that we have identified. But then it's a separate question. What are the opportunities? What is the opportunity register? How do we identify actively the opportunities? But the opportunities also pose threats and risks in a traditional sense, negative impact, let's say. We've been trying to fill some of our customers' risk registers first with threat approach and then fill it with opportunity register so that it actually becomes a full register with opportunities and threats in it, which both are then assessed with negative and positive impact. And that has been a process where you then actually can embed the discussion around opportunities in a, let's say, uniform way to the risk management process, which is not that common, but we definitely want always to take the opportunities along with the threats. Yeah, and maybe
Gentlemen,
another thing.
I'm looking at the time.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that maybe we'd like to just briefly touch the topic of risk matrices at this point. And then I know, Miki, that you wanted to share a few screenshots as well, go into the sort of the tangible side of things maybe. So if you prepare for that in the meantime, and could you maybe Mark share a couple of thoughts about setting risk matrices?
Okay, I'm going to mix it a bit with the thought also I think we have on the list of topics of pitfalls, and I think the first thing I'd say is we've all started off by saying we need to think about this and define our appetite and our tolerance, and I could argue that a risk matrix is a tool which we develop based on what our appetite and tolerance is, that we then use to enable decision making. So it is an important way of sort of implemented in what the top of the organization has put in place. So the first thing is all of those who go off and just grab a risk matrix off the internet and then say, let's use it, that thought process has clearly not happened. And it is one risk matrix which may be used in one organization is not applicable to another. And if you think, I know there's a lot of people from healthcare here, if you can think of a GP surgery versus a university hospital, if you both use the same risk matrix, you're probably not using an appropriate risk matrix. You need to think it through. Also, the level of risk you're willing to take in different ways may be different between the two environments, perhaps not with regard to safety. So there, you can go through a process to think this through. You go through the process thinking about the sort of things we've talked about in appetite and tolerance. And you want to do that conversation with senior people so they understand the risk matrix. So you've got to think about what you're designing it for. Is it for a project? Is it to help people make decisions, go, no go? Are we trying to do it to make sure that risks at different magnitudes will be signed off by people at appropriate levels, the sort of the chart of authority type concepts? We do it for buying things, so shouldn't we do it for saying it's okay to operate this? Well, if it's very risky, it's the person at the top who will say it's okay because they're managing the risks and the benefits. So you've got to structure it and thinking about how are you going to use it. You can go through some logical things like that looking at what are the sort of magnitudes, as if you're thinking about the consequence side of it, what is the sort of magnitude of, if you're talking just about threats, losses, harms you could have. If you're in an environment where in general the harm is going to be one person at a time, you might get up to one fatality. If you're in something like an oil and gas, you might go up to multiple fatalities. If you're working in a library, your cost range may only go up to a few $100,000. If you're working again in offshore, you might be wanting to go into tens of millions. So you've got to think about the dimensions to be appropriate to your organization, and then you have to have a conversation. If you look at the biggest loss, you've got to say, how often can we tolerate it or accept it? And that starts to be putting it in. And so I could argue that in the classic red, yellow, green, and I think there's more ways of doing risk matrices than that, the red yellow line is a question for different types of consequences. How much can we tolerate? How often can we tolerate having that loss level? I can argue that the colours or the zones you have are more about the appetite side of it, a LARP concept or approval chart swings. But you need to think those through and you need to work it out and make sure it's consistent with it. The other thing that's challenging is appetite is not constant. Your risk appetite will change, and it can change potentially. It will change based on you have an organization, you suddenly decide you've got a good amount of funds. You decide to go and do something, you start a project, suddenly those funds aren't there. You could say my buffer to help manage risk has gone. When it's gone, my appetite will go down, or you could say I'm using all my appetite up on the project. It's going down elsewhere, so I'm not willing to do things. So you've got to bring into mind that actually what your appetite is can change, and therefore you've got to think about how you implement that to an organization. So what is acceptable today may not be the same, and what my appetite is today may not be the same as it will be in the future. So I think those are just some things to think about. And as I said, there's a structured process you can go through to build an appropriate matrix that reflects where your appetite and tolerances are, but you should be regularly reviewing it also, which is difficult, and I've not seen people really doing, to say, actually, do we still think it reflects where we want to be?
Great commentary. I would add also on sort of building risk matrices. It's not a technical exercise in itself. It's very much a sort of logical decision-making oriented process. What you want to achieve and how do you want to analyze the data. And sort of the typical critique of risk matrices are that they're two-dimensional or too narrow in terms of what data they can capture. That's certainly one thing that we've been looking at Inclus, how to make it multidimensional and actually involve a lot of stakeholders and a lot of data behind the assessments and the considerations around risks. But maybe before going to the sort of actual demonstration of couple of models, I definitely want to keep that short because I want to pick Mark's brain on a couple of more things, especially about psychology and risk appetite a bit still further. But one thing is often that how well you can determine on what you want to take as a risk, or what you want your appetite to be, and what you afford to actually have. So we have had, for example, construction project clients where the budgets are often in hundreds of millions, but they also have hundreds of risks. And one project in particular had an average cost of a risk approximating to 1 million euro per risk if they realize, and they had over 200 risks. So if you start losing and 10, 20, 30% of the risks realize, then you very quickly lose the profits of the project, and it will of course a lot of headache. So many companies sort of set aside a risk provision where they calculate the theoretical maximum of the realized risks, and then of course you have to weigh that with risk sort of capacity and also the mitigation controls that you put in place, and then weigh the risk provision with that. But that to be said, maybe if I show some examples how you can integrate the thinking of opportunities and also the risk appetite in practice in a digital format, so that it becomes a bit more visual and clear for everybody what we actually then mean with risk tolerance or risk appetite. Just a couple of minutes if I share the screen and perhaps start with one quick example of a company that must have a lot of consideration on risk. I came across this company recently who are building basically flight packs for humans to fly. And if you consider the amount of risk and opportunity involved in this kind of business, it's staggering. If you consider first the business level, you are building a new disruptive industry and business. There is a lot of business risks involved. You are creating new technology. You have to invest into unknown technology frontiers. Probably you have to test a lot. And then you have the human risk element with injury or death of your test pilots and your customers. So this, risk management is truly not about avoiding risk. It's actually taking risk is if you excel in risk management. I think that was, Mark, one of your sort of key ideas that I picked up on from our previous discussion, that risk management is actually about allowing you to take risk if you take them in a measured way. But if we go to the sort of implementation on how to look at the risk matrices, for example, typically we are looking at likelihood, for example, in the x-axis and impact on the y-axis, and that's how we approach risk. Or then we combine there with, for example, multiplying the risk impact with 1.2 and then multiplying that with risk likelihood as a risk score or some sort of formula depending on the organization. But then you can actually put those against the opportunities. So then we have risks that are high in the risk score, but there's virtually no opportunity. For example, data privacy violations wouldn't have too much of opportunity properly in them. But then if we go to some other risks, economic downturns, for example, we might have new business models coming from a segment that is going down if we have actually figured out what are the opportunities there. Or we might want to handle customer complaints with a particularly good process so that actually that risk becomes an opportunity if we can create a completely new customer experience for our customers. So always look at the risk score against the opportunities, my take. Another is that when we talk about sort of residual risk after the risk controls, we can then actually set a risk tolerance objective for all of the risks across the board separately. Of course, typically you do them by categories, but you could do it also sort of risk by risk, so that you can prioritize the risk matrix in a sense, which is not a matrix here, but rather it's a bar chart where we can then automatically calculate easily, of course, what is the risk reduction need. So where we are actually farthest in our residual risk and our risk tolerance. So either we need to get the residual risk closer to the risk tolerance with our mitigation actions, or then we have to be aware that we are actually bearing quite a lot of risk on certain topics where we wouldn't like to have that. And then we have to figure out other ways, maybe insurance or transferring the risk to partners or something, but we have to figure out ways how to handle those. So this is one way to look at the residual risk against the risk tolerance. We can also set, for example, suppliers. We can set exact limits for particular suppliers, which can be monetary figures as well, where we can then calculate based on different risk categories how much that supplier bears on us against their limit, and then we can monitor whether the supplier is over their individual limit or not, and whether they are going down, and what are the risks actually comprised of. So these are some of the considerations that you can actually put in place when you are considering how do we then embed that risk appetite and tolerance thinking into the process itself.
Great.
Thanks.
Listen, we have one question from the audience, and then you mentioned, Miki, that you have a couple of things that you'd still like to pick Mark's brain on. So I suggest that maybe we can take the question at this point and then go from there. So the question is here: how do we determine a risk-bearing capacity?
Okay, there's probably judgment in this in my mind. I always think of risk capacity as the magnitude of risk you could take that if it was realized, you realize the risk, which is a bit of a consequence thing, then actually you'd probably go out of business or be shut down. There may be levels of risk if you're in the public sector where you could argue that you won't go out of business, but your board will all disappear and there'll be a complete turnover of personnel. So you can do it. People in the money world will do it with money. If I haven't got the money to be able to pay for that loss, then in a sense that defines it. It's a bit more difficult when you start to talk about things which are a bit different, like harm to people or reputation. But fundamentally, to me, if I'm doing a financial thing and I have the capacity to cover the costs, if something goes wrong, then you could argue it's within my capacity. If I don't have the capacity, then I'm bust. And therefore you're beyond my capacity. It's beyond everything. Tolerance, I might not be willing to tolerate losing more than an X% of the amount of capacity I have, and my appetite might be less than that. So it's not always that your capacity is bigger than your tolerance, is bigger than your appetite, but commonly that is the case. So test things against when would it effectively mean we're out of business is the way I would simplistically put it. I hope that was helpful for the person who asked it.
And maybe if I quickly add the sort of concept of resilience or business continuity, which is often looking at the sort of scenarios of unknown shocks that we just for some reason, some of our business operations gets shut down, for example, and how do we recover from those, and then we are more focusing on the corrective actions than the preventive actions, and often risk management process is primarily focused on the preventive actions, and business continuity is on the corrective actions. Of course, both have both elements, and it depends on the sort of culture what you're using there. But I very much think that the sort of resilience question is the key here. Also, whether there is rigidity or agility in the organization to actually maneuver and sort of handle problems as they sort of unfold is a key aspect of bearing risk. So you don't necessarily always have to be formally prepared for everything, but if you are agile as an organization to maneuver around and through risk when they realize, there's also a benefit in that. If you consider, for example, the special forces of the UK SAS, I think their motto is "Who dares wins." So it's not exactly sort of describing probably their whole sort of operating model, but certainly it gives you an idea that you have to be able to encounter risk when they realize, and you have to be capacitated to actually maneuver through all sorts of problems. And this is also one thing that we need to bear in mind, that risk resilience and capacity is not only about stockpiling and sort of preparing official or formal preparedness actions. Of course, it's also that, but it's also about the capacity of the people to handle problems in a bigger picture.
Good. Hey, we have another question, and I suggest again that we address it now and then go from there. So who within the organization should know the set risk appetite of the organization, and how should this be communicated?
Okay. The appetite and tolerances in a way get set at the top, and then they get implemented down through the organization. So you can say that it should go all the way down. It may be expressed differently at different levels in the way it is, and it may be that some people will not be in a role where they are, you could say, assessing, managing. They are just implementing things. So they are, I don't know, checking something each day, or whatever. That's part of the process, or they're manufacturing something, they're making it. So to me, it is in the management side of things, because risk management is what we're talking about here. They should understand the amount of risk they're able to take. Now, in an organization, that means that the way it's expressed at the top should be meaningful, or should be translated down to everybody. And when we talk about trying to get people to do all of the risk management, one element of that is to get them to understand what is the appetite and what is the tolerance within, and you can, as I said, we've sort of talked about implementing it using a risk matrix, and there are other ways. I don't want to stick on that one. There are other ways you might do it. It might be test against statements. Are we complying with what we're saying here? So it's a communication through what I'd call the risk communication activities, part of what you're doing all the time. It's bringing it down, and it is, if you can, embedding it in the ways you do your work, so that people, when they follow the ways they do the work, should be complying with the risk appetite of your organization.
Great.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Yeah, there's another question on just specifically in the system. Does it have the option of linking key risk indicators with each risk and tolerance limit? Yeah, so certainly we can create risk indicators. We can evaluate those and monitor the progress of the risk indicators against the tolerance as well. Gets a bit more complicated than what I just showed, but that's definitely technically possible. Also a model that we use often in scenario planning, that we break down the scenarios into indicators, and then we can determine the likelihood of that scenario realizing depending on the sort of relevance of the indicators at a particular time. Yeah, there's actually multiple questions coming in, so maybe if we take those further.
Yeah, sorry, I was in the Q&A, but there's a whole bunch in the chat. Again, looking at the time, we have 10 minutes left now, so let's use like 5, 6, 7 minutes now to tackle questions here, and then let's leave a couple of minutes in the end just for the last slide.
Okay.
So Okay, we have indeed a whole bunch of questions now. So
Shall I pick up the one which comes in from, I will never pronounce it, it's W. Walliet, I hope I pronounced that correct, apologise, which is asking what could drive one's appetite to increase or decrease? And I'm going to say that there's loads of things. There's some which are incremental and some not. But if you can imagine that you were BP the day before Macondo happened and the day after, and you could think about what your appetite might be in general. I'm not saying it's, I'm going to say in both cases, probably it was not in favor of having it before and after, but your ability to manage risk before and after would have been severely changed, because reputationally, if you were to have another equivalent event, you would be in a far worse position than you were the day before having the event. And that's an extreme thing. So incidents, things that go wrong, can influence appetite. That incident will go in the press. The press will therefore, you could say, things that come up in the news can adjust your appetite. It's not just your appetite as well. Sorry, your instance. It may be that a competitor or somebody in the same sector as you has an incident goes wrong, then clearly the appetite across the whole of the industry may well change. So if you think about roller coasters, we had the Smiler incident. The whole industry had to sort of up its game to try and deal with the risk, that type of risk, to build back up. They had to become, you could say, less tolerant. It's a safety risk again, so it would have been very intolerant to start with, to be fair. But it's the concept that you would then have to say, no, we need to really focus on this even more. We have to give even more confidence that we are managing this risk in the manner in which we say we are, in order to build up the confidence in you could say their clientele. So it's not just, it doesn't affect just your appetite. If somebody has an incident, it doesn't just affect their appetite, it can affect yours. So what happens, I think, is really, and there can be other things, like you could become more mature in risk management and evolve, and slowly that means you can do risk appetite in a different way. It doesn't necessarily change the appetite, it may change you from being more qualitative to being more quantitative. It could be the example I gave before, where you were sitting on a bunch of money and you actually then go and use it for something, and in doing so your buffer has been reduced, something like that. So there could be decisions you make to change your appetite, as well as, you could say, realization of risk.
Yeah, thank you. Would you like to address maybe one of the questions, Miki?
Yeah. So there's actually in the Q&A section, there's a couple of questions, and in the actual chat there's more. Yeah, we certainly, if we are left with some questions unanswered after this session, we can definitely book a call either with Mark or us to discuss these questions further. We are more than happy as risk enthusiasts to really think about these things and learn also from you, as you are also the industry leaders in your field. But let me still cover a couple of these questions. There's a question from Antti Järvinen. You could also compare how far you are away from the agreed risk transfer limit, insurance coverage, etc., when companies' risk-bearing capacity. Yeah, that's more of a comment, and that's a great comment applied probably at ST1 from Antti's organization. Very, very interesting models there. Aki Rantanen also asking what would be good ways to define and quantify the risk appetite in practical manner on a certain risk category or business line. Is there some quantitative measures you would recommend? Yeah, well, I think that the quantitative measures would be typically done by financial impact, because that's most comparable across all the business lines and divisions. Typically they are vastly changing in terms of the value that the business units are creating. So you might need to sometimes sort of weigh the impact the financial impact somehow, for example, the percentage for that business unit's turnover or EBIT or something like that, and then you can from the hard data seek for their financial and then consider what is actually the sort of weight impact of a certain risk to a certain business line and so on. But goes to bit technical question and depends a bit on the well. Mark, do you want to look at any question as well?
I was going to do some quick ones. It says, can you have different risk appetites for operational risk, strategic risk, and generally? Yes, people tend to break down their appetite. And as I was trying to say earlier on, was that it's good to do that in the same way that you report risk. So you might have a different appetite for financial versus project versus safety, or operational versus strategic, whatever. You can do that. You just need to be sure you define your appetite in a way that I would say is measurable, and you can, as if you're a senior manager, you can compare back and say, are we meeting what our appetite is? There's a question which says, should the agreed appetite relate to both current and target post-mitigation scores? I would argue that the appetite is something which reflects what you end up with, because the tolerance they are driving you to try and adjust your risk to be within the amount of risk you're willing to take to achieve your objectives. So the current risk may be below or above your appetite. It may be below or above your tolerance. If it's above your tolerance, really you should stop because you're taking too much risk. It's beyond what you're willing to accept. If it's above your appetite, you would be wanting to put in controls to bring down the risk. If you're below your appetite, it may depend on what you're doing, whether you just let the risk rise or not to your appetite. If you think there's risks you can take which give you a better outcome and it's still within your appetite, you may make an adjustment to do that. That's quite legitimate. So that was one question I saw. The bit, yes, to define the level of risk, probability times impact is applied. Could you please suggest a way of defining impact when it can be applied in different spheres, operational, financial, reputation? I'm going to dispute the very first bit. Risk is a function of likelihood and consequence, or likelihood and impact. It is not one times the other. We as humans tend to be more intolerant of, i.e. our tolerance level, our risk tolerance for major accidents, which result in large levels of harm, large levels of loss, is you could say lower on the pure risk impact times probability calculation than it would be if you were talking about regular small incidents, or risk events. So I don't think you can simply say risk is probability times impact. When you talk about operational, financial, reputation, you will have probably different statements if you're using risk appetite statements for each. If you're trying to build it into a quantitative or qualitative model, you're going to have to start to match things up. And you can see that with risk matrices, where you will have meanings of consequences linked into safety, environment, financial, reputation, and so on. So you can map them together. Takes some thinking and has to be done, and should link back to the high-level statements. So hopefully those are some of the questions, and we're at 1 minute to go, so I better shut up. Sorry, apologies.
Yeah. No worries, Mark.
Yeah,
it was great insight, and we were left with quite many questions still unanswered. If you allow, we will invite you another time as well, because I also wanted to talk about the psychology of risk appetite and risk management a bit with you as well. But we can maybe save those later. Over to you, Irkku, to close the session.
Yeah, thank you, Miki, and thank you, Mark. Indeed, very, very interesting discussions, and let's make sure to follow up later on these topics. In the meantime, I pulled up the one last slide that we had. We're advertising. We have already set up or scheduled our next webinar towards the end of February, and that's gonna be done with Charlotte Candy, also from the UK, as it happens. And we are going to be talking about risk culture in an engaging fashion. So that's going to be interesting. So you can just follow the QR code and sign up. Similarly, you can contact Mark directly, and we have included his contact details there. I'm sure you will, since we didn't have time to address all those questions, well, feel free to contact him directly and go from there. And if you'd like to see Inclus in action, then you can also follow this QR code and schedule a meeting with us and see how it works and how it could potentially support your risk management processes. Thank you all very much for your time and interest, and sorry for being 1 minute over time. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Miki, for the great discussion, and have a great rest of the week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.